Hello, my friends, and welcome to Fishery. I'm Alexander Williamson, your host, as always, and today we are going to be talking about one of my favorite topics, and that is analyzing fish, talking about the history, the evolution of fish, and how humans interact with fish. Now, we're going to be talking about the Betta splendens, and an article just came out recently in the news. And as of 2025, a university in Australia had research done, and it has produced some pretty wild headlines saying that betta fish are the most mistreated fish in the pet hobby. Probably in the entire pet hobby, but definitely in the pet fish hobby. Now, I would argue that goldfish, feeder fish, things like that are also a high contender for this. But in sheer numbers, yes, bettas are a very common fish as a pet, and they do have a very hard time because of myths about how they supposedly survive in just a cup of water. And in this study, they did hard scientific research, and they looked at different aquarium sizes. And then they looked at 15 different behaviors that bettas do, whether that's blowing bubbles, swimming, foraging, flaring their fins, aggressively making a stance, making a show to a female or to a male, like making a show of their finnage, and so on and so forth. There was a whole list of things. You can go read the article, which I will link below if you're curious about the details. But then they put them in 4 different size aquariums, ranging from teeny tiny little cups to a 2.5 gallon aquarium to a 5.5 gallon aquarium to a 20-gallon aquarium, and then they even put them up in like a 250-gallon aquarium in another study that was done a few years ago. And the other thing that we're going to talk about is the fact that they tried to do research on wild betta and the fish known as the Betta splendens. The problem with this is that recent DNA research has also shown that the Betta splendens is no longer a fish in the wild that we would think of as the fish that's in the hobby. There is a fish called the Betta splendens in the wild, but it is getting exceedingly hard to find, and that fish in the wild is far more docile, peaceful, and less colorful, has less finnage, and it is found only in a very few places, whereas the Betta splendens, as we've been calling it, is actually 5 species of bettas that have been crossbred and selectively bred by humans for over 1,000 years. So there are no wild bettas in the sense that what you see as a betta in the aquarium shop or at your local pet store is almost certainly not an actual wild betta, and it's probably not even a species of betta, it's a hybridized species. Now, because of this, in 1975, when they did research on seeing how much space bettas needed in the wild in their natural habitat, they found some really interesting results. And then when they tried to replicate this in the aquarium hobby, showing bettas living in aquariums of sizes all the way up to swimming pools, they couldn't replicate what was going on in the wild, and they didn't know why back then. Now, before this, they hadn't done the ethnographic research, or rather in interviewing Thai tribes people and Cambodian and Malaysian and Indonesian folks who have been breeding bettas for, like I said, over 1,000 years. And they didn't put together the fact that these are a breed, just like there's wolves, and those are a type of dog. There's also corgis and poodles and chihuahuas, and those are all the same thing in theory, but they act very differently depending on how they were selectively bred. Just like the bettas in our hobby can be very different looking as well, they were mostly bred for 1,000 years to wrestle with one another. Then for the last 300 years, they were bred to specifically not just wrestle, but to end one another's life, or to wrestle until one of the fish was no longer living. And I want to say now, according to YouTube guidelines, this video is not going to have graphics in it because YouTube hits me with copyright content, or they hit me with strikes on guidelines. They will find something to hit me with. Even if I say Siamese, we'll say boxing instead of the other word that starts with an F, fish. So Siamese boxing fish. I can't even say that word oftentimes without getting flagged. But in this video, I am not showing any harm to animals. I am purely discussing scientific and educational research that I hope will allow pet keepers and betta keepers to make informed decisions on how to keep their fish in a proper condition that is correct for the well-being of that fish. And any sort of intentional placing fish together for aggressive results to be filmed or for entertainment is illegal in my country and many others, and I am not endorsing it in any way. This is for historic, educational purposes, okay? I hope we get that all clear. And there's not going to be even any images, so you can sit back and listen. And if you want to read the research papers, I will link them and have photos of the highlighted research we talk about on the Discord page, which you can join, but there's also a free section if you just want to check that out. Come and check out the Discord. All right, with that, all that said, let's get back to the topic, which is the wild bettas. So, in 1975, they found that out in rice paddies, wild bettas, as we know them to be, betta splendens, they found that there were 1.7 males for every square meter, for every 36 inches by 36 inches of water. So, literally what I could carry in my arms, this much surface area of water, there could be anywhere between 2 inches of water in the fields all the way to a foot. And granted, bettas sometimes swim into deeper water, sometimes even to 1 inch water. But these bettas are generally in fairly shallow flooded fields, rice paddies, or jungles. And in that natural habitat, they noticed that every 36 inches by 36 inches, or 90 centimeters by 90 centimeters roughly, that they are finding 1.7 males. So almost 2 males on average in that space, and 3 or 4 females hanging out with each male, and they're just fine. So they went to the aquarium, and in 1980, they did studies, and they put them in all sizes of tanks, all different sizes of tanks, all the way up to 175 liters, which is over 200 gallons. And they tried to put 2 males in an aquarium with females and see what would happen. And every time they would fight. And so why was this? Because they were using pet bettas from the pet hobby. When they went to the wild and they took wild bettas, even in a tank without plants, without anything which they called enhancements, so no plants, no live food, no rocks or leaves or botanicals for them, no setup that was natural, just a bare bottom glass tank, the wild bettas would oftentimes approach, flare, and then separate. And that was the end of it. However, the pet bettas almost always would end up with, out of 8, when they would put 12 females and 8 males in a container that was L-shaped and that had all the natural plants, all the things a fish could want, they still ended up with an average of 2 or 3 of the males being deceased at the end of a week. However, after that week, they then had a whole year in some cases without another fatality. So basically it shows that these are highly territorial fish and that we have bred them to be hyper aggressive. In the wild, it's not unheard of that for them to harm one another to the point of death, but it is far less likely. They will simply usually back down, swim away, go somewhere else, and hang out next to another male that's not so alpha and that doesn't have a harem of 10 females. Maybe they'll be off in the periphery of the rice paddy with other males that are kind of lower ranking and more their size to pick on, so to speak. Well, keep all this in mind. That's the studies in the past. Now we're talking about pet bettas now and the ethics of keeping them in an aquarium. So saying we're keeping them solo in an aquarium, not even with other bettas, just to keep a betta. So they looked at bettas and they said, all right, let's categorize all their behavior in a set period of time. And at the university in Australia, there was a man, a professor there, and his name is Colum Brown, Dr. Colum Brown, at Macquarie University in Australia. And basically, they took the 4 different sizes of the size you'd see at the pet store, like basically less than a liter of water, a quart of water, and they put them in a little cup size or jar size container. And then they put them in a 2.5 gallon container, a 5.5 gallon container, and a 20-gallon container, as well as, you know, even though it's not documented every hour or whatnot, they also had kind of a control group that they put in a 200-gallon container to see how much a betta would swim if it had unlimited room, essentially, or theoretically enough space to move however much it wanted. And that was the size that they tried that on. So then they had that as a control for telling them if a betta can swim its heart out until it wants to, you know, swim until its heart's content, that's how much it is. And that's what they used as the basis. But what I want to talk to you about is how we calculate welfare of a fish. So in this study, they said that when a fish swims, that is a good behavior, that's good, that the fish swam all around the aquarium and that it was happy, and that in the small cup, the fish just sat there and none of them swam at all. However, they moved to the next tank up, the 2.5 gallon, and the fish swam a decent amount. They moved to the 5.5 gallon and the fish swam as much as it did in the giant tank, and same with the 20. The fish swam that much again, all right? So this is telling them, all right, the fish is swimming a lot, right? So it's probably fine. It's happy. It's got enough room. So the author concludes that the fish only need 2.5 gallons for a single fish to swim around and be happy. Now, when they put an enhanced aquarium together for each of these sizes, so along with having just a blank aquarium in each of these sizes, they then did one with all sorts of plants and botanicals and everything you would find, live Daphnia and things, everything you would find in an enriched environment for a betta in the wild using domestic betta lines. And they put them in the aquariums, and they did the same study again, and they found that the bettas didn't swim quite as much when they had a enhanced environment. And so they postulated, well, they don't want to swim, they're just chilling because they're relaxed, you know, they're happy. And so that accounts for some of that. So this to me means that their data is being interpreted very, very non-subject. I mean, it's very, very just whatever the person watching wants to think of the betta. Now, granted, I think also I prefer keeping betta in a very natural setting rather than a plain glass jar. In my thinking, I would think a fish prefers that. You probably think that too. But what I want to point out in this study is this graphic in particular, and it shows that the smallest container and the middle-sized container before the next size up, that there's an anomaly that we see here. And it shows that right in the middle-sized container, there is a big discrepancy of the fish swimming around a whole lot more than in the next containers. And so isn't the fish clearly happier in a 5.5 gallon aquarium or in a 10 gallon aquarium? Like what are we supposed to draw from this graph? And somehow they decided to say that 2.5 is fine and that 5.5 is better long term. But in the pet store, they need to not be in these cups. They need to be 2.5 gallon aquariums. And then we see more natural betta behavior. And what they did was every 15 seconds or every 30 seconds, depending on the study, they took note of a list of 10 to 15 betta behaviors. And this study's been done 3 different times at different universities, and the sizes of containers vary. And I'll put all the data down here. But what I wanted to mention about all of this that I think is more fascinating than their suggestions about bettas, which for me, for all practical purposes, I think is fine. The suggestion that bettas in stores should have at least 1.5 gallons or about 5 liters of room to hang out, and it should have an enrichment of at least plants, or one plant and a stick and a rock and some gravel, and they should have good food, frozen or live food. They also say that when you get them home, you should put them in a 15 to 20 liter container, meaning a 3.5 to a 5.5 gallon container. Now, I don't have a problem with that either, and I think it should be enhanced too. But these are domesticated bettas. So like I just talked about the whole beginning part, these are the more aggressive kind. And we have been breeding these bettas the last 30 years for looks. And some people have also been selecting them to be more peaceful. But that isn't really our goal still to this day in most cases. And we end up with bettas that still have that hundreds of years of being bred aggressively. And unfortunately, yes, they were very aggressive after all that breeding. And even though they have a domestic gene by the name of DMRT1, and that marker, that gene DMRT1, is the domestication gene. It's also in goldfish, it's in carp, and it's in zebra danios. We also see it in cats, dogs, horses, elephants. So things we would think of as typically domesticated, and it usually means that they're going to have larger eyes proportional to their other facial features, smaller mouths, larger ears, in the case of dogs and cats, and they're going to be more docile. But in the case of bettas, we overpowered this gene that made them more friendly to humans that exists in fish, which is incredible. That's fairly new data as well. And we made them mean, just like we did with certain dogs, where we wanted them to harm each other or harm people or whatnot. And it's sad to me that that's the case, but what you should take note of is that it means that most of the information on these fish is done on betta splendens, in quotes, when that is a domesticated version of the fish that they got for the study. Most university studies, especially pre-2010, were not using wild-caught bettas. They were using pet bettas or lab-bred stock bettas. And that means that they were from that aggressive lineage. Even so, they found that there are always outliers. Some individuals that are super aggressive and some that will not fight no matter what as males, with other bettas, that is. So being alone in a tank, you may not know what kind you have, but especially if you're going to keep a sorority of multiple fish or you're going to try to breed fish, they definitely found, that you can select for peaceful fish. You can select for aggressive fish. And in studies, when they use domesticated bettas, they have to figure out by looking at flaring and how often they're flaring their fins, how often they're in a fighting stance, they have to decide which ones to toss out of the research and which ones to keep. Otherwise, they have very skewed data with like outliers that are way out there. So if they don't do it that way, the other way they account for it is they say that, the top 10% aggression or the bottom 10% of peaceful fish get thrown out, and only that middle 80% of fish data counts. Either way, though, that is not the average of a wild betta, let alone a different species, of which we know with hybrids and things, there's over 100 combinations of hybrid and different species of verified taxonomically unique bettas in the world. So if you're talking about how much space a wild betta imbelis or a wild betta rubra or a wild betta ruber or a wild betta macrostoma needs, they're all going to be very, very complex, very different. And I would say defer to experts in the hobby, even over science, unless they've studied that exact fish in captivity, and not by going off of this data for bettas overall. So really what I want you to take away from this is, yes, we need to treat the bettas better in the hobby. I think that's just an obvious thing. They want to be heated. They're from the tropics. They want an enhanced environment because that's where they come from. They evolved that way. Even in captivity, when they're being bred domestically, a lot of times they still have, leaves and sticks or botanicals, and they're in a pond with a group of fish being spawned, and then only later are they selected for and bred in jars and set next to each other, and that's a whole different process. We can talk about selective breeding fish later. But these fish are still appreciative of the things that are hardwired in their DNA evolutionarily as their environment, as their habitat. A barren glass container is not what they evolved to be in, and they do seem to be lethargic when that occurs. But what I want to say is we cannot take the word of these research papers at face value, even when they confirm what we want to believe. So yes, I want to believe that bettas are or bettas that are deserving of a peaceful, restive, and the most thriving and happy, healthy environment that they could ever want in the aquarium and in their new homes. However, that is a subjective thing. It's not an objective thing necessarily. And we need to do things like measure their stress hormones or measure their responses that we know are happy due to the endocrine levels of different hormones that they produce when they're spawning, for instance, or when they're eating. We can assume that those are positive. And then when they are at rest, that's probably that's probably your neutral or baseline. And then we know from when they're being harmed or when they're hurt, they release different hormones. I would go off those chemical signals far more than behavior, because as they state in the study, if you were trying to tell me how if a lion is happy or sad in captivity, you could say, oh, the lion that runs around is the happy lion. Give it a big enclosure. Well, they find when you give a lion a small enclosure, it moves way more than when you give it acres of open space. And that's because it paces around nervously. So who's to say that a fish in an open and barren glass tank isn't going to move around the most because it's trying to fill its time. It's bored and it just wants to, get on with the day. And maybe something will change if it explores its space. So maybe that accounts for so much swimming, and maybe that shouldn't be the baseline for what a happy betta is. Also, I want to point out that this guy who did the study, the professor, Colum Brown, also does animal welfare work, and he has been an advocate for bettas for 6 years, at least that I can find, him speaking to the media and to other publications saying that bettas need, a big tank like this, that they need plants, that they need enrichment, and that they're smart, sentient beings. And he actually says that they are sentient beings that feel pain in a way that is akin to humans feeling pain and depression and other emotions. Now, granted, I may feel something similar in my gut, but when he writes at the top of his research paper that there are no conflicting biases for this research, I think we need to be honest with ourselves that this was not a good study. And any peer review is going to look at this and say, there's a big problem here. This guy has spent a lot of his time maybe getting reimbursed in some sort of monetary way. I doubt it. But, with an agenda trying to say we need to treat bettas better, and then the very article is published in a journal of science and medicine for zoological things, so animals and organisms, and it's in the it's in the journal for animal welfare, and that right there is a loaded term. So why wouldn't it just be in the Journal of Science or the Journal of Ichthyology? It's in the Journal of Animal Welfare. So it has an agenda. It's there to try to convince people that this is something we should change. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm saying that it has an impact on the findings. And the way that they classify things, you should look into. Read the papers for yourself and decide what else behaviorally. I'm just going to mention the swimming, but what about eating? Are they nervously eating? What about flaring? is a fish that lives 1 year, but he's the alpha male or the top male. Alpha male is a poor term. He's the dominant fish. He's the dominant male fish in the betta colony. Does he live a better life when he gets 15 females he can mate with and he is the top guy, but then he's going to get unfortunately dethroned next year by the next toughest male? I don't know. What about the betta that lives 4 years and never gets in any fights and is totally peaceful, but he only gets 1 or 2 females to mate with, and he doesn't get access to food and to color enhancing, really tasty insects in the part of the pond that the stronger, more dominant males get? Who's living a more fulfilled life? And I would say as humans, it's hard for us to judge that, and we need to be careful when placing these judgments on animals. I'm not saying we can't. I'm saying we need to be honest with ourselves when we do this, because we are up against scrutiny in this hobby. And while you can take it too far and say that no fish should ever be pets, being in captivity is mean and cruel, I mean, just go out and look at fish in the wild. You can go to the other extreme and say that fish in the wild have worms. They're fighting each other for territory. They're sick. Their fins look like crap a lot of times. They're missing scales. You know, that's just the natural state of wilderness. So what is a better life? It's somewhere in the middle. It's something subjective. And I'd love to hear what you guys have to say. And does this study really have much meaning at the end of the day when I tell you guys all this stuff? Does the fact that they swam more in a big tank versus a little tank, does that tell us anything? Or just instinctively, can we use our brains as a human and think that, yeah, your average fish is going to want a nicer setup than an empty container or a little bag? I don't know. But it's all stuff to think about, and I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I can't do these deep dives where I do a whole lot of research on things without you. I could make another 5 episodes about this research and going through it in detail, but YouTube is so harsh on these videos that even using any image of a fish oftentimes gets flagged as being against guidelines. And so I wanted to start off this easy with this kind of audio-based deep dive overview of what all I've gathered work on. And if you guys want to hear more about it, more about each individual study, more about, anything I talked about, please let me know below. Also, to the people who like, subscribe, who become members of the channel, or who join the Discord and want access to even more of the behind-the-scenes stuff, and they pay the $2.99, don't buy it on Apple Store. You have to pay 33% more a month. So buy it through Android or on PC. Usually you have to buy it on a laptop or a computer, Discord that is. And then once you're a member, you can download the app on an Android phone or an iPhone and use it there. But get your subscription through Discord itself or through the Google Store or the Android App Store, because it's not worth paying 33% more to Apple for no added features, nothing else. Okay. All right, you guys, that's it. I just wanted to thank you all so much for doing what you do, for being who you are. And I'll be who I am next time when we see you on the next episode of Fishery. Have a great day. Take care. Much love.